They say silence is golden, but sometimes silence is the sharpest blade you can wield. My name is Amara, and this is the story of how I became CEO, without saying a single word about it until it was already done. This is the story of how my racist boss handed me the keys to his kingdom while trying to lock me in the basement. And trust me, the irony is sweeter than any victory speech I could have ever given. Let me take you back to where it all began, to that sterile conference room on the 32nd floor of Morrison & Associates, where the air always smelled like expensive coffee and even more expensive egos. I was sitting at that polished mahogany table, the one that reflected everyone's faces like a mirror of corporate hierarchy, watching my boss, Mr. Davies, present my strategy to the board. Yes, my strategy. The one I had spent 3 months developing, the one that would save the company $12 million in operational costs, the one that would revolutionize how we approached client acquisition in the digital age. But as I sat there, listening to Davies speak with the confidence of a man who truly believed he had authored genius, I realized I was witnessing something both predictable and infuriating: the theft of intellectual property wrapped in a 3-piece suit and a Harvard MBA. Davies clicked through the PowerPoint slides, each one a piece of my soul converted into corporate speak, each bullet point a testament to weeks of research, analysis, and strategic thinking that had consumed my evenings and weekends. He gestured with the authority of someone presenting his life's work, his voice carrying that particular tone that white executives use when they want to sound both innovative and experienced simultaneously. The board members nodded appreciatively, their expensive pens scratching notes on leather portfolios, their faces showing the kind of impressed recognition that I had dreamed of receiving for my own work. But I wasn't receiving it. I was watching it being stolen in real time, in front of people who mattered, by a man who saw me as nothing more than a very efficient research assistant with an impressive title. As you can see, Davies said, clicking to slide 17, which contained my risk assessment matrix. This approach minimizes exposure while maximizing growth potential. The beauty of this strategy lies in its scalability and adaptability. The beauty of this strategy, I thought, lies in the fact that I created it from scratch while you were playing golf with clients who were already planning to sign with us anyway. But I didn't say that. I simply sat there, my face a mask of professional composure, taking notes on my own presentation as if I were learning something new. Because that's what you do when you're a Black woman in corporate America, and you want to survive long enough to actually make a difference. You smile, you nod, you take notes on your own brilliance being presented by someone else, and you plan. After the meeting, as the board members filed out with their leather portfolios and their satisfied expressions, Davies approached me with that particular smile that predators use when they want to remind their prey who's really in charge. "Great meeting, Amara," he said, his hand landing on my shoulder with the casual ownership of someone who thinks he has the right to touch you without permission. "Your research really helped pull that presentation together. Your research. Not your strategy, not your innovation, not your intellectual property. Your research. As if I were some kind of corporate librarian who had simply compiled existing information rather than the strategic architect who had designed a completely new approach to client relations." "I'm glad I could contribute," I replied. "Because what else do you say when your boss has just stolen credit for your work in front of the people who determine your future? You certainly don't create a scene in the hallway outside the boardroom. You don't demand recognition for something that's already been attributed to someone else. You take notes, mental notes, about who was in that room, who heard what, and who might remember the details when it matters most. But the real moment, the one that changed everything, came 3 weeks later during my annual performance review. Davies had called me into his office, that corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a corporate throne room. The walls were lined with his degrees, his awards, his photographs with various politicians and business leaders, all of them creating a backdrop of authority that was supposed to intimidate and impress. He gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk, that furniture arrangement that automatically creates a power dynamic where he looks down at you even when you're both sitting. "Amara," he began, leaning back in his executive chair with the confidence of someone who has never had to question his place in the world. "I want to talk to you about your future here at Morrison & Associates." The way he said it, with that particular pause before future, immediately told me this wasn't going to be the career advancement conversation I had been hoping for. This was going to be something else entirely. Something that would require me to dig deep into whatever reserves of professional composure I had left. He opened my personnel file, those manila folders that contain the official version of who you are according to corporate bureaucracy, and began flipping through pages while speaking. Your performance metrics are excellent, truly outstanding. Your client satisfaction ratings are through the roof, your project completion record is flawless, and your strategic thinking. He paused here, and I could practically see him remembering my stolen presentation. Your strategic thinking shows real promise. Promise. As if I were still an intern showing potential rather than a vice president of strategy, who had already delivered results that exceeded every target and expectation. However, he continued, and there it was, the word that every ambitious person learns to fear in performance reviews. I think we need to have a realistic conversation about career trajectory and expectations. He closed the file and looked directly at me, his expression shifting to something that was supposed to look paternal, but actually looked more like a predator sizing up prey. You're an exceptional operator, Amara. You execute strategies brilliantly. You manage teams effectively. You deliver results consistently. But leadership, real leadership at the C-suite level, requires a different set of qualifications. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but recognition. I was about to hear something that would clarify exactly where I stood in this company's hierarchy. And it wasn't going to be based on my performance, my results, or my qualifications. It was going to be based on something much simpler and much more infuriating. The reality is, Davies said, leaning forward as if he were about to share some profound wisdom, corporations like ours, at this level, require leaders who can relate to our client base, who can represent the company in certain circles, who can, he paused, searching for the right euphemism, who can embody the traditional values that our stakeholders expect to see. Traditional values. There it was, wrapped in corporate speak, the same message that has been delivered to ambitious Black women for decades. You're good at what you do, but you're not what leadership looks like. You can execute, but you can't lead. You can deliver results, but you can't represent the company. You can be excellent, but you can't be the example. But Davies wasn't finished. He had more wisdom to share, more reality to deliver, more limitations to explain. I'm not saying this to discourage you, he continued, which is exactly what people say when they're about to say something deeply discouraging. I'm saying this because I believe in setting realistic expectations. You could have a very comfortable, very successful career here. Senior vice president is certainly within reach, maybe even executive vice president in the right circumstances. But CEO? That's a different conversation entirely. He leaned back again, his hands folded on his desk, his expression shifting to something that was supposed to look sympathetic, but actually looked more like satisfaction. Between you and me, Amara, and I'm only saying this because I care about your development, Black women, well, let's just say the board, the clients, the stakeholders, they have certain expectations about who runs companies at this level. It's not about capability, it's about perception, reality, market dynamics. And there it was. Not wrapped in euphemism this time, not disguised as career advice or market analysis. Just raw, honest prejudice delivered with the confidence of someone who truly believed he was doing me a favor by explaining the limitations of my existence. Black women don't run corporations at this level. That was his reality, his truth, his explanation for why my excellence would only take me so far and no further. I sat there for a moment, processing not just what he had said, but how he had said it, with the casual authority of someone stating an obvious fact rather than expressing a racist opinion. He wasn't angry or emotional about it. He wasn't trying to hurt me or put me in my place. He was simply explaining the natural order of things as he understood them, the way someone might explain that water flows downhill or that the sun rises in the east. This was just how the world worked, according to Davies, and my skin color was simply an immutable characteristic that would prevent me from reaching the highest levels of corporate leadership. I appreciate your perspective, I said finally, because what else do you say when your boss has just explained that your race disqualifies you from advancement? You don't argue with them, because that just confirms their suspicions about your attitude and professionalism. You don't get emotional, because that confirms their beliefs about your stability and judgment. You don't threaten them, because that confirms their fears about your character and intentions. You simply thank them for their honesty and begin planning their professional destruction. I'm glad we could have this conversation, Davies replied, his relief obvious. He had delivered the difficult message, established the boundaries, explained the rules, and I had accepted them without drama or confrontation. From his perspective, this had gone perfectly. He had managed to keep his most productive employee happy while ensuring that she understood her place in the corporate hierarchy. He had maintained the status quo while appearing to be honest and caring about my development. But what Davies didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood because it required a level of strategic thinking that apparently only I possessed, was that he had just handed me the blueprint for his own downfall. He had revealed his limitations, his blind spots, his fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually works in modern corporations. He thought he was protecting his position by explaining why I could never threaten it, but he was actually showing me exactly how to make him irrelevant. Before I continue with how I turned his weapon against him, let me pause here to talk about something important. If you're watching this, if you're hearing this story, you probably understand what it feels like to have someone look at you and see limitations instead of potential. You probably know what it's like to have your excellence explained away, your achievements minimized, your ambitions dismissed as unrealistic. That's exactly why I created Black Revenge Diaries, to tell the stories of people who refuse to accept other people's limitations as their reality. These are stories about how excellence becomes the sharpest weapon against prejudice, how intelligence defeats ignorance, how patience conquers arrogance. If these stories resonate with you, if you want to hear more about people who turn their obstacles into stepping stones, hit that subscribe button right now. Because trust me, we're just getting started, and what happens next is going to prove that sometimes the best revenge is simply being everything they said you could never be. Now, let me tell you about the chess game that Davies never knew he was playing. See, while he was busy explaining the limitations of my existence, I was busy analyzing the structure of his power. Where did it come from? How was it maintained? What were its vulnerabilities? And most importantly, how could it be transferred to someone more deserving? Because that's what strategic thinking actually looks like, not just accepting the current reality, but understanding how to change it systematically and permanently. The first thing I realized was that Davies's power was almost entirely positional rather than personal. He wasn't CEO because he was particularly brilliant or innovative or visionary. He was vice president executive because he fit a certain demographic profile that the previous leadership had valued, and because he had managed to avoid making any major mistakes that would threaten his advancement. His authority came from his title. His title came from the board's approval, and the board's approval came from their perception of results. Change the perception. Change the power structure. The second thing I realized was that Davies had made a critical error in his assessment of how modern corporate boards actually make decisions. He was operating from an outdated model where advancement was based on personal relationships, golf club memberships, and cultural similarity. But Morrison & Associates had just brought in 3 new board members, all of them focused on performance metrics, return on investment, and strategic innovation. They didn't care about tradition or perception or market dynamics. They cared about results, and results were something I could provide documentation for. The beautiful thing about corporate bureaucracy, the thing that Davies had forgotten in his casual racism, is that everything is documented. Every project has metrics. Every strategy has measurable outcomes. Every success has a paper trail. And if you're smart enough to maintain your own records, if you're careful enough to document your contributions, if you're strategic enough to ensure that your work can be traced back to your individual efforts, then you have something more powerful than political connections or demographic advantages. You have proof. So I began what I privately called Operation Documentation. Every report I wrote, every strategy I developed, every client relationship I managed, every project I completed, I made sure there was a clear record of my individual contribution. Not in an obvious way that would make Davies suspicious, but in the careful, methodical way that someone with a legal background learns to create evidence. Email timestamps, revision histories, meeting minutes, project timelines, client communications, financial projections, risk assessments, implementation schedules, success metrics, everything that could possibly demonstrate not just that work had been done, but who had actually done it. And here's where Davies' arrogance became his weakness. Because he was so confident that his position was secure, because he was so certain that I understood my place in the hierarchy, he never bothered to monitor what I was actually doing. He would assign me projects. I would complete them brilliantly. He would present the results as his own work, and everyone would be satisfied with that arrangement. Except that arrangement left a documentary trail that told a very different story than the one Davies was presenting to his superiors. Take the Hartwell Industries account, for example. Davies had presented the acquisition strategy as his own innovation, but the email records showed that I had initiated contact with Hartwell's CEO, developed the initial proposal, negotiated the preliminary terms, and structured the final agreement. Davies' contribution had been to approve my recommendations and present them to the client. But because he controlled the narrative, because he was the one with the title and the access to senior leadership, the official record showed Davies as the architect of a successful acquisition that brought in $14 million in new revenue. Or consider the digital transformation initiative that Davies had presented as his vision for the company's future. The project management software showed that I had created the implementation timeline, identified the technology vendors, managed the pilot program, trained the user base, and measured the performance improvements. Davies had attended the kickoff meeting and the final presentation. But again, because he controlled the official narrative, the board recorded showed Davies as the strategic leader who had guided the company through a successful modernization process. Pattern after pattern, project after project, success after success, the same story repeated itself. I would identify opportunities, develop strategies, manage implementation, deliver results, and Davies would claim credit for the outcomes. From the outside, it looked like Davies was an exceptionally productive executive with an unusually capable team. From the inside, it looked like Davies was an executive who had figured out how to systematically steal credit from his most talented subordinate. But here's what Davies didn't understand about modern corporate governance, and here's where his old-school approach to office politics became his fatal flaw. The new board members at Morrison & Associates weren't just interested in hearing about successful projects from senior executives. They wanted to understand the actual mechanics of how those successes were achieved. They wanted detailed analysis, comprehensive documentation, specific metrics, individual accountability. They were operating from a data-driven approach to leadership evaluation that Davies was completely unprepared for. So when the CEO announced his retirement, and the board began evaluating potential successors, they didn't just schedule presentations from the obvious candidates. They started requesting detailed project histories, individual performance records, strategic planning documents, anything that could help them understand not just what had been accomplished, but who had actually accomplished it. And that's when my careful documentation strategy began to pay dividends that Davies couldn't have imagined. The board requested files, and I provided files. They asked for project timelines, and I provided timelines with my name and signature on every key milestone. They wanted to understand strategic thinking processes, and I provided detailed analysis that showed exactly how each successful initiative had been conceived, developed, and implemented. But I didn't volunteer this information in a way that looked like I was undermining Davies or campaigning for his position. I simply responded to official requests for documentation with the thorough, professional, well-organized records that any competent executive should maintain. And here's where Davies's racism became his professional blindness. Because he had mentally categorized me as a talented subordinate who understood her limitations, he never considered that I might be positioning myself as his replacement. When the board started requesting more detailed information about project management and strategic planning, Davies assumed it was just part of their standard due diligence process. He never imagined that my careful documentation was actually creating a parallel narrative about leadership and results that completely contradicted the story he had been telling about his own contributions. I need to pause here because what I'm about to tell you is the most important part of this entire story, and I want to make sure you understand why it matters. What I did next wasn't just about getting revenge on a racist boss, though that was certainly satisfying. It was about proving something fundamental about how power actually works in the modern world. It's not enough to be excellent at what you do. You have to be smart about how you document that excellence and strategic about how you present it to the people who make decisions about your future. If you've ever had to find a creative way to work around a toxic boss, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who wanted to overlook you, if you've ever had to be twice as good to get half as much recognition, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you've ever had to outmaneuver someone who underestimated you, and drop a comment telling me about your own experience with turning obstacles into opportunities. Because what happens next is going to show you exactly how patience and preparation can defeat prejudice and arrogance. But I want to hear your stories too. The turning point came during what Davies probably thought was just another routine presentation to the board. The CEO had asked each of the potential successors to present their vision for the company's future, along with specific examples of their leadership experience and strategic thinking. Davies had prepared what he clearly considered to be his masterpiece, a comprehensive presentation that highlighted every major success from the past 3 years and positioned him as the natural choice to lead the company into its next phase of growth. I watched him that morning, adjusting his tie in the reflection of his office window, practicing his opening remarks, reviewing his slides with the confidence of someone who truly believed the outcome was predetermined. He had that particular energy that successful men get when they're about to claim something they feel entitled to, that combination of nervousness and excitement that comes from anticipating a promotion that feels both earned and inevitable. "This is it, Amara," he said to me as we waited outside the boardroom, his hand on my shoulder in that familiar gesture of casual ownership. "After today, everything changes around here. New leadership, new vision, new opportunities for everyone." The way he said "new opportunities for everyone" made it clear that he was still thinking of me as a valuable subordinate who would benefit from his advancement, someone who would be grateful for whatever increased responsibilities he might delegate to me once he was running the company. But while Davies was preparing his presentation about leadership and vision, I was preparing something entirely different. The board had requested that all potential successors provide detailed documentation of their individual contributions to the company's recent successes, and I had spent weeks creating what I privately called the real story, a comprehensive analysis of every major project from the past 3 years, complete with email trails, project management records, client communications, financial data, timeline analysis, and individual accountability metrics. I hadn't presented it as opposition research or as criticism of Davies's leadership. I had simply responded to the board's request for documentation with the most thorough, professional, well-organized collection of evidence that any executive could possibly provide. Every claim I made was supported by data. Every success I highlighted was backed up by measurable outcomes. Every strategic decision I documented was connected to specific results that the board could verify independently. The presentation room that day felt different than usual, charged with the kind of energy that comes when important decisions are about to be made. The board members had arrived early, their leather portfolios thicker than usual, their expressions more serious than typical. They had clearly done their homework, reviewed the documentation, analyzed the data, and were prepared to ask the kind of detailed questions that separate actual leaders from people who just look like leaders. Davies went first, and his presentation was exactly what you'd expect from someone who had spent his entire career perfecting the art of taking credit for other people's work. Confident delivery, impressive graphics, compelling narrative, strategic vision, all of it designed to reinforce the impression that he was the obvious choice to lead the company forward. He clicked through slides, showing revenue growth, client acquisition, operational efficiency, market expansion, every metric that mattered to board members and investors. "As you can see," Davies said, gesturing toward a graph that showed the company's improved performance over the past 3 years, "the leadership strategies we've implemented have delivered consistent results across every major category. Revenue is up 37%, client retention has improved by 22%, operational costs have decreased by 15%, and employee satisfaction surveys show the highest ratings in company history." The board members nodded appreciatively, taking notes, asking occasional questions about methodology and implementation. Davies answered confidently, speaking with the authority of someone who truly believed he had been responsible for the successes he was presenting. From his perspective, he had been the senior executive in charge during a period of exceptional growth, and the results spoke for themselves about his leadership capabilities. But then something interesting happened. The board chair, Dr. Martinez, a woman who had built her own consulting firm before joining Morrison & Associates as an independent director, began asking questions that went beyond the standard presentation format. She wanted to know about specific decisions, individual contributions, detailed timelines, exact sequences of events that had led to particular outcomes. "Mr. Davies," she said, consulting her notes, "can you walk us through the decision-making process that led to the Hartwell Industries acquisition? Specifically, I'm interested in understanding how you identified the opportunity, developed the initial strategy, and managed the negotiation process." Davies paused for just a moment, the kind of pause that happens when someone is trying to remember details about something they didn't actually do themselves. "Certainly," he replied, clicking to a slide that showed the financial impact of the Hartwell acquisition. It was a complex process that required careful analysis of market conditions, competitive positioning, and strategic fit. We identified Hartwell as a target based on their client base and operational synergies, developed a comprehensive acquisition strategy, and executed a negotiation process that resulted in favorable terms for all parties. Dr. Martinez continued taking notes, but her expression suggested that Davies' general overview wasn't providing the level of detail she was looking for. "And the initial contact with Hartwell's leadership? How was that relationship established, and who managed the preliminary discussions?" Another pause, slightly longer this time. Davies was clearly trying to navigate between taking credit for the success and avoiding specific claims that could be contradicted by documentary evidence. "The initial approach was part of our broader client development strategy," he said carefully. "We had identified Hartwell as a potential partner, and our team made contact through our existing network of industry relationships. But Dr. Martinez wasn't satisfied with corporate speak and general overviews. She had clearly reviewed the documentation I had provided, and she was asking questions that would require Davies to either admit that he hadn't been personally involved in the details or make specific claims that could be fact-checked against email records and project timelines. "I see," she said, flipping through her notes. "And the digital transformation initiative that you mentioned earlier. Can you explain the technology selection process and the implementation timeline?" Davies clicked to another slide, this one showing metrics about improved operational efficiency and employee productivity. "The digital transformation was a critical strategic priority," he began, "and we approached it with a comprehensive analysis of available technologies, vendor capabilities, and implementation requirements. The key was balancing innovation with practical considerations about user adoption and operational disruption. Again, perfectly reasonable executive language that said absolutely nothing about who had actually done the work. Dr. Martinez exchanged glances with two other board members, the kind of subtle communication that happens when experienced leaders are sharing the same concerns about what they're hearing. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, with Davies clicking through slides and providing general overviews, while the board asked increasingly specific questions that he answered with increasingly vague responses. By the end, it was clear that while Davies could present results impressively, he couldn't provide the detailed knowledge that would be expected from someone who had actually been hands-on involved in achieving those results. When Davies finished, there was polite applause and the kind of professional thank you comments that don't reveal anything about the audience's actual impressions. He gathered his materials with the satisfied expression of someone who felt he had delivered exactly what was expected, and he left the boardroom with the confidence of someone who believed he had just secured his promotion to CEO. Then it was my turn. I had prepared a very different kind of presentation, one that focused not on claiming credit for past successes, but on demonstrating detailed knowledge about how those successes had been achieved and what they revealed about effective leadership in the modern corporate environment. My slides didn't just show results, they showed processes. They didn't just highlight achievements, they analyzed the strategic thinking and tactical execution that had made those achievements possible. "Good afternoon," I began, looking directly at each board member before continuing. "Rather than simply presenting outcomes, I'd like to walk you through the actual mechanics of strategic leadership, using specific examples from our recent successes to illustrate how effective decision-making translates into measurable results. I clicked to my first slide, which showed not just the final numbers from the Hartwell acquisition, but the entire timeline of how that deal had been structured. The Hartwell opportunity came to my attention through industry research I was conducting on potential strategic partnerships, I said, providing the specific detail that Davies had been unable to offer. Initial contact was made on March 15th through a direct email to their CEO, Rebecca Hartwell, who had spoken at the Digital Marketing Summit about challenges in their current vendor relationships. Dr. Martinez looked up from her notes, her attention clearly focused on the level of detail I was providing. I continued clicking through slides that showed not just what had happened, but how it had happened, when it had happened, and who had made it happen. Email timestamps, meeting schedules, decision trees, risk assessments, negotiation strategies, implementation plans, every element that demonstrated hands-on involvement, rather than high-level oversight. The preliminary proposal was developed over a 3-week period, I continued, with input from our finance team on valuation models, our legal team on regulatory considerations, and our operations team on integration requirements. The initial draft was completed on April 8th, revised based on their feedback on April 15th, and finalized on April 22nd, after incorporating suggestions from both legal teams. This wasn't corporate speak or general overviews. This was the detailed knowledge that comes from being personally involved in every aspect of a complex project, from conception through completion. And more importantly, it was knowledge that could be verified against documentary evidence that the board already had in their possession. I spent 45 minutes walking them through, not just what Morrison & Associates had accomplished over the past 3 years, but exactly how those accomplishments had been achieved. Not in a way that was designed to undermine Davies or campaign for his position, but in a way that demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking, tactical execution, and leadership capability that would be required to guide the company through its next phase of growth. When I finished, the questions from the board were different than the ones they had asked Davies. Instead of trying to verify whether I had actually been involved in the projects I was discussing, they were asking about my analysis of what those projects revealed about effective leadership, my assessment of the company's strategic challenges, my vision for how those challenges could be addressed. Ms. Johnson, said board member Robert Chen, your presentation suggests that you've been intimately involved in most of our major strategic initiatives over the past 3 years. How do you see that experience translating into the kind of leadership that will be required at the CEO level? It was exactly the kind of question I had been hoping for, the kind of question that would allow me to demonstrate not just what I had accomplished, but how I thought about leadership, strategy, and corporate governance. The experience has taught me that effective leadership in the modern corporate environment requires both strategic vision and tactical execution, I replied. It's not enough to identify opportunities and delegate implementation to others. Real leaders need to understand the details of how their strategies actually work in practice, because that's the only way to make intelligent adjustments when circumstances change. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with board members asking about my assessment of the company's competitive position, my analysis of industry trends, my recommendations for addressing operational challenges, my thoughts on talent development and organizational culture. These weren't questions about past performance. They were questions about future leadership, about strategic thinking, about the kind of decision-making capability that would be required to run a company in an increasingly complex business environment. When the presentation ended, I gathered my materials with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done exactly what they had intended to do. I hadn't campaigned for Davies's job, or criticized his leadership, or made any direct claims about why I would be a better choice for CEO. I had simply demonstrated the kind of detailed knowledge, strategic thinking, and leadership capability that modern boards expect from senior executives. But as I left the boardroom that day, I knew that something fundamental had shifted in the company's power structure. The board had seen 2 very different presentations about the same results, and those presentations had revealed 2 very different levels of actual involvement in achieving those results. They had heard Davies talk about leadership in general terms, and they had heard me demonstrate leadership through specific examples. They had listened to claims about strategic vision, and they had seen evidence of strategic execution. The waiting period was the hardest part. Those weeks between the presentations and the board's final decision, when everyone in the company was speculating about who would be chosen as the new CEO. Davies maintained his confident demeanor, clearly believing that his presentation had gone well and that his advancement was still inevitable. He continued treating me like a valuable subordinate who would benefit from his promotion, occasionally making comments about new opportunities and expanded responsibilities that would be available once he was running the company. But I could sense something different in the way other executives were interacting with me, the way board members acknowledged me during company events, the way senior staff members were positioning themselves in relation to the ongoing succession process. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be interpreted as confirmation of any particular outcome, but subtle changes in behavior that suggested people were reassessing the likely future power structure. The announcement, when it finally came, was handled in exactly the way that modern corporate boards prefer to manage sensitive personnel decisions: quietly, professionally, and with minimal drama or public spectacle. No company-wide meeting, no grand presentation, no ceremonial passing of authority from one leader to another. Just an email from the board chair to senior staff, with instructions to check their inboxes for updated organizational charts and reporting structures. What happened next was the moment that made every frustration, every stolen idea, every casual insult worth it. But before I tell you about Davies' reaction to that email, let me ask you something. Do you think the sweetest revenge is the kind your enemy sees coming, or the kind that hits them when they're least prepared? Because what the board did next proved that sometimes the most devastating victories are the ones that happen in complete silence, without fanfare, without warning, without giving your opponent any chance to prepare or respond. If you want to hear how this story ends, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed to Black Revenge Diaries. Because what happens when Davies opened that email is something that every person who has ever been underestimated needs to hear. I was in my office that Tuesday morning, reviewing quarterly reports and preparing for what I assumed would be another routine week, when my phone buzzed with the notification that would change everything. It was an email from Dr. Martinez with the subject line, "Organizational updates, effective immediately," and something about the phrasing made me pause before opening it. In corporate communications, effective immediately usually means that someone's world is about to change dramatically, and the formal tone suggested this wasn't going to be routine administrative updating. I opened the email, and the first sentence made me read it twice to make sure I was understanding correctly. The board of directors has completed its evaluation of leadership succession and has made the following appointments to the executive team. What followed was a detailed organizational chart showing the new corporate structure, with my name listed at the top as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, reporting directly to the board of directors. I stared at the screen for a moment, processing not just the information, but the implications of how it had been communicated. No phone call to prepare me, no advance warning, no ceremonial announcement. Just a straightforward email treating my promotion to CEO as a routine administrative matter, the same way they might announce a new vendor contract or an updated vacation policy. The board had made their decision, implemented their decision, and informed everyone simultaneously about their decision. But it was the second paragraph that really captured the elegant brutality of what the board had done. Mr. Davies will be transitioning to a new role as Senior Vice President of Client Relations, reporting to the Chief Executive Officer. All current project assignments and team leadership responsibilities will be reassigned according to the attached organizational structure. They hadn't fired Davies. They hadn't created a dramatic confrontation or forced him to resign in humiliation. They had simply restructured the company in a way that moved him several levels down in the hierarchy, while elevating me several levels up. From his perspective as my former boss, he had just become my subordinate. From my perspective as his former subordinate, I had just become his supervisor. The reversal was complete, total, and irreversible. I could hear phones buzzing throughout the office as other employees received the same email, and I could imagine the conversations that were starting to happen as people processed the news and began to understand what it meant for the company's future direction. But from my office, I could also hear something else that made the moment even more satisfying. The sound of Davies' door slamming shut, followed by what sounded like a very intense phone conversation conducted in the kind of lowered voice that people use when they're trying not to be overheard discussing something shocking. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock on my door, and Davies entered without waiting for permission. his face showing a combination of confusion, disbelief, and barely controlled anger that I had never seen from him before. He was holding his phone in one hand and a printed copy of the organizational chart in the other, and his normally perfect executive composure had been replaced by the kind of agitation that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly proved wrong. "Amara," he said, and his voice had a quality I had never heard before, something between a question and an accusation. "I just got off the phone with Dr. Martinez. There seems to be some kind of mistake with this organizational announcement. Some kind of error in the communication." I looked up from my computer screen, my expression carefully neutral, and gestured for him to sit down in one of the chairs across from my desk. The same chairs where I had sat just months earlier while he explained the limitations of my existence, the same power dynamic that had now been completely reversed. "I don't think there's been any mistake, Mr. Davies," I replied, using his formal title for the first time in years. "The board has made their decision about the company's leadership structure." He remained standing, too agitated to sit, too shocked to fully process what was happening. "But this doesn't make sense," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "I've been with this company for 12 years. I've delivered consistent results, built strong client relationships, managed successful teams. I presented my vision to the board just last week. How could they possibly—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to articulate the question that was really bothering him. How could they possibly choose a black woman over him? The board's decision was based on their assessment of leadership capability and strategic vision, I said, maintaining the same professional tone I had used with him for years. I'm sure they considered all relevant factors when making their choice. I didn't mention the documentation I had provided, the detailed analysis of actual contributions, the evidence of hands-on involvement in every major success. I didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. Davies finally sat down, his shoulders sagging as the reality of the situation began to penetrate his initial shock. "I don't understand," he said, and for the first time since I had known him, he sounded genuinely vulnerable rather than arrogantly confident. Everyone assumed the succession planning discussions always centered around my readiness for the CEO role. Perhaps, I replied carefully. The board was looking for something different than what those discussions had assumed. I paused, letting him process that information, before continuing. The modern corporate environment requires leaders who can demonstrate not just strategic vision, but tactical execution. Not just the ability to present results, but the knowledge of how those results were actually achieved. He looked at me with a new kind of attention, as if he were seeing me clearly for the first time. "You're talking about the projects," he said slowly. "The documentation the board requested. The detailed analysis of individual contributions." His voice was getting quieter as he began to understand how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. "You documented everything." "I maintained professional records of my work," I corrected. "The same way any competent executive should maintain records of their contributions to the company's success." I didn't mention that those records had been specifically designed to create a parallel narrative about leadership and results that completely contradicted the story he had been telling about his own involvement. Davies sat in silence for several minutes, his mind clearly working through the implications of what had happened. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a surprising personnel decision or an unexpected change in corporate direction. This was the result of a carefully planned strategy that had been executed over months, maybe years, while he had been completely unaware that he was being systematically replaced. "The Hartwell acquisition," he said finally. "The digital transformation project, the client retention improvements, the operational efficiency gains." He was listing the successes that had formed the centerpiece of his presentation to the board, the achievements that he had claimed as evidence of his leadership capability. "You were behind all of that. I was involved in all of that," I corrected again, still maintaining the professional distance that would be required for our new working relationship, as were many other members of the team. Successful projects require collaboration and coordination across multiple departments, but Davies wasn't interested in diplomatic language or corporate speak. He was finally seeing the chess game that had been played around him, the strategic maneuvering that had repositioned every piece on the board while he had been focused on claiming credit for successes that he hadn't actually created. "You planned this," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and resentment. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "I focused on delivering results," I replied. "The board's decision about leadership was based on their assessment of who could best guide the company forward." I paused, then added, "I'm sure they appreciated having detailed documentation about how our recent successes were achieved and what those successes revealed about effective leadership." Davies stood up abruptly, his agitation returning as he fully grasped the extent to which he had been outplayed. "This is," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find words that would adequately express his frustration without crossing the line into insubordination. Because that's what he was now. My subordinate, reporting to me, dependent on my evaluation of his performance for his continued employment. "This is a significant change for all of us," I said, completing his thought in a way that emphasized the new power dynamic. "I'm sure it will take some time for everyone to adjust to the new organizational structure, but I'm confident that we can work together effectively to continue delivering the kind of results that our clients and stakeholders expect." The phrase "work together effectively" hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of everything that had changed in our relationship. Davies was no longer the executive who could casually touch my shoulder or explain my limitations or steal credit for my work. He was now someone who would need to justify his continued employment to someone he had systematically underestimated and professionally undermined. "I should probably get back to work," he said finally, his voice hollow. "I imagine there will be a lot of adjustments to make in the coming weeks." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to me. "For what it's worth, Amara, you've certainly proven that I was wrong about—" He trailed off again, unable to finish the sentence. "About what, Mr. Davies?" I asked, my voice perfectly neutral, but my eyes holding his with the kind of direct attention that demanded honesty. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been respect. "About what it takes to run a corporation at this level," he said finally. "About who has the capability to lead a company like this." I nodded acknowledgement, but didn't respond verbally. There was nothing more to say. The conversation was over, the power dynamic was established, and the new reality was now in effect. Davies left my office quietly, closing the door behind him with the careful attention of someone who was no longer sure about his place in the world. I sat back in my chair and looked out the window at the city skyline, the same view that Davies had enjoyed from his corner office for 12 years, the same perspective that now belonged to me. But more than the view, more than the title, more than the salary increase or the stock options or the executive parking space, what I had won was something much more valuable: the proof that excellence could defeat prejudice, that intelligence could overcome ignorance, that patience could conquer arrogance. The rest of that day was a blur of congratulatory phone calls, transition meetings, and administrative details that come with any major organizational change. But throughout all of it, I kept thinking about that moment in Davies's office months earlier when he had explained the limitations of my existence, when he had told me that Black women don't run corporations at this level, when he had suggested that I should be realistic about my career trajectory and accept my place in the corporate hierarchy. He had been so confident in his assessment, so certain about the natural order of things, so comfortable with his explanation of why my excellence would only take me so far and no further. And in his confidence, in his certainty, in his comfort with the status quo, he had revealed exactly how to destroy him professionally, not through confrontation or emotion or political maneuvering, but through the simple demonstration that he was wrong about everything that mattered. The following weeks brought the usual challenges of any leadership transition: learning new responsibilities, building relationships with board members and major clients, establishing my vision for the company's future direction, managing the inevitable resistance from executives who had been passed over for promotion. But throughout all of it, I maintained the same professional demeanor that had served me so well during my rise through the corporate hierarchy. Davies, to his credit, adapted to the new reality with more grace than I had expected. He showed up to work on time, completed his assignments professionally, participated in team meetings constructively, and generally behaved like someone who understood that his continued employment depended on his ability to work effectively under new management. Our interactions were cordial but formal, maintaining the appropriate boundaries for our new professional relationship. But I could see in his eyes, during those moments when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the ongoing struggle to reconcile his previous assumptions about corporate leadership with the reality of his current situation. He was learning, perhaps for the first time in his career, what it felt like to have his professional fate determined by someone he had systematically underestimated. He was discovering that talent and intelligence and strategic thinking couldn't be contained by other people's expectations or limited by their prejudices. 3 months into my tenure as CEO, Morrison & Associates announced record quarterly earnings, with revenue growth that exceeded analyst projections and profit margins that impressed even the most demanding board members. The success was the result of strategic initiatives that had been in development for months, projects that I had designed and implemented, while Davies had been focused on taking credit for my work and explaining my limitations. During the quarterly board meeting where we announced those results, I looked around the table at the faces of the directors who had made the decision to promote me over Davies. Dr. Martinez caught my eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that confirmed what I had suspected. The board had known exactly what they were doing when they chose me as CEO. They had seen through Davies' presentations to the reality of who was actually driving the company's success. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came during the company-wide meeting where we announced the quarterly results to all employees. As I stood at the podium explaining our strategic achievements and financial performance, I could see Davies in the audience, sitting in the middle section with other senior vice presidents, listening to me present results that were based on work I had done while reporting to him. The irony was perfect and complete. The man who had told me that black women don't run corporations was now watching a black woman run the corporation that employed him, announce record profits that she had generated, and outline a strategic vision that she had developed. And he was doing it as my subordinate, someone whose continued employment depended on my assessment of his performance. After the meeting, as employees were filing out of the auditorium, Davies approached me with an expression that I had never seen from him before, not the casual confidence of someone who felt entitled to my attention, not the patronizing concern of someone who thought he was helping me understand my limitations, but something that looked almost like humility. "Congratulations on the quarterly results," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than the performative politeness I had grown accustomed to. "The strategic initiatives you've implemented have clearly been successful." "Thank you," I replied, noting his use of the word you rather than we, or the team. It was a small but significant acknowledgement of individual responsibility, the kind of recognition that he had never given me when our roles were reversed. He paused for a moment, as if he were trying to decide whether to say something more. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "for a lot of things, but especially for—" He looked around the auditorium, taking in the setting where I had just presented company results as CEO, while he sat in the audience as a subordinate. For not understanding what real leadership looks like. It was the closest thing to an admission of his previous racism that I was ever going to get from him, and honestly, it was more than I had expected. "I appreciate that," I said, meaning it. "And I hope we can continue to work together effectively going forward." "I'm sure we can," he replied, then added, "under your leadership." The phrase carried weight beyond its literal meaning, acknowledging not just the current organizational structure, but the reality that I had earned my position through competence and strategic thinking, rather than demographic advantage or political connections. 6 months later, Morrison & Associates was featured on the cover of Forbes magazine as one of the fastest-growing companies in our industry, with a profile that highlighted our innovative approach to client relations and strategic development. The article included a photograph of me in my office, the same corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows that had once belonged to Davies, looking out over the city skyline that now represented my sphere of influence rather than his. But the detail that made the Forbes article particularly satisfying was a small paragraph buried in the middle of the piece. The company's remarkable turnaround has been attributed to CEO Amara Johnson's hands-on approach to strategic planning and her detailed knowledge of operational processes. Unlike many executives who rely primarily on delegation and high-level oversight, Johnson has maintained personal involvement in every major initiative, creating a culture of accountability and precision that has translated directly into measurable results. The article didn't mention Davies by name, But anyone who understood corporate dynamics would recognize the implied criticism of leadership styles that prioritize presentation over substance, delegation over involvement, claims over evidence. The Forbes journalist had captured exactly what the board had recognized months earlier: that effective leadership in the modern corporate environment requires more than just the ability to look the part or sound authoritative in meetings. The real vindication came a year later, when Davies submitted his resignation to accept a position with a smaller company where he would be returning to his previous role as vice president executive. He had spent 12 months working under my supervision, and while he had performed his duties professionally, it was clear that the new dynamic had never become comfortable for him. "I want to thank you for the opportunity to learn from your leadership style," he said during our final meeting, his words carrying a sincerity that would have been impossible to imagine during our previous working relationship. "I've gained a much better understanding of what it means to really know the details of your business. I hope your new position works out well for you," I replied, meaning it. Davies had learned something valuable about the difference between claiming credit for results and actually creating those results, and that knowledge would make him a more effective executive wherever he ended up. After he left that day, I sat alone in my office thinking about the journey that had brought me from his subordinate to his supervisor to his former boss. The path hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been quick, but it had been methodical, strategic, and ultimately successful. I had proven that excellence could overcome prejudice, that intelligence could defeat ignorance, that patience could conquer arrogance. But more than that, I had proven something that Davies had never understood during his years of casual racism and systematic credit stealing: that underestimating someone based on their demographic characteristics is not just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid. When you dismiss someone's potential because of their race or gender, when you assume that their excellence has natural limitations, when you treat them as subordinates who should be grateful for whatever opportunities you choose to give them, you create exactly the conditions that will eventually lead to your own professional destruction. Davies had handed me the blueprint for his downfall the moment he explained why I could never threaten his position. He had revealed his blind spots, his vulnerabilities, his fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually works in modern corporations. And in doing so, he had given me everything I needed to systematically demonstrate that he was wrong about leadership, wrong about capability, wrong about who deserved to run companies at this level. The beautiful thing about the whole experience was that it had required no dramatics, no confrontations, no political maneuvering, no appeals to fairness or justice or corporate diversity initiatives. It had simply required excellence, documentation, and the patience to let results speak for themselves. Davies had been defeated not by activism or advocacy, but by the simple demonstration that he was less competent than someone he had systematically underestimated. 2 years later, Morrison & Associates was acquired by a Fortune 500 company for a price that represented a 400% return on investment for our shareholders. The acquisition was based on the strategic value of the client relationships, operational processes, and intellectual property that we had developed during my tenure as CEO. The same work that Davies had spent years taking credit for had become the foundation for the company's most successful exit in its corporate history. During the acquisition celebration, I gave a speech to the entire company about the importance of recognizing and developing talent wherever it exists, about the value of maintaining detailed records of individual contributions, about the difference between claiming credit for results and actually creating those results. I didn't mention Davies by name, but anyone who had been with the company during the transition period understood the subtext. Success in the modern corporate environment, I said, requires leaders who understand that excellence can come from anywhere, that talent doesn't conform to traditional expectations, and that the most dangerous mistake any executive can make is underestimating the people who work for them. The audience applauded, but I was thinking about something else entirely. That moment in Davies' office when he had explained the limitations of my existence, when he had told me that Black women don't run corporations at this level, when he had suggested that I should be realistic about my career trajectory and accept my place in the corporate hierarchy. He had been so wrong about everything that mattered, and his wrongness had become the foundation for everything I had achieved since then. The acquisition made me financially independent. But more importantly, It had proven something that went far beyond personal success or professional advancement. It had demonstrated that the future belongs to people who can deliver results rather than people who can claim credit for other people's results. It had shown that competence will ultimately triumph over prejudice, that intelligence will eventually overcome ignorance, that patience and strategic thinking will always defeat arrogance and entitlement. But perhaps most importantly, it had proven that the most devastating revenge is not the kind that destroys your enemies, but the kind that makes them irrelevant. Davies hadn't been fired or humiliated or publicly embarrassed. He had simply been replaced by someone better, someone who understood that true leadership requires more than just looking the part or sounding authoritative in meetings. Today, I serve on the boards of 3 Fortune 500 companies, and I'm frequently asked to speak at conferences about leadership, strategic planning, and corporate governance. But the question I'm asked most often is about how to handle workplace discrimination, how to navigate corporate politics when you're dealing with prejudiced supervisors, how to prove your value to people who are determined to overlook your contributions. My answer is always the same. Document everything, excel at everything, and trust that results will eventually speak louder than prejudice. Don't waste energy on confrontation or emotion or appeals to fairness. Focus on being so good at what you do that your competence becomes undeniable, your contributions become indispensable, and your value becomes impossible to ignore. Because the truth is that people like Davies are ultimately their own worst enemies. Their prejudices make them blind to talent. Their arrogance makes them vulnerable to strategic thinking. Their entitlement makes them careless about the details that actually matter. And when you combine those weaknesses with someone who has the patience to document everything and the intelligence to let results speak for themselves, the outcome is as predictable as it is satisfying. That's the story of how I became CEO without my racist boss ever seeing it coming, how I turned his weapon against him, and how I proved that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply being everything they said you could never be. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated because of who you are rather than what you can do, if you believe that excellence is the ultimate response to prejudice, then you need to subscribe to Black Revenge Diaries right now. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and drop a comment telling me about your own experience with turning obstacles into opportunities. Because the truth is that people like Davies are everywhere, in every industry, at every level of corporate hierarchy. They're the ones who steal credit, who limit opportunities, who explain why certain people don't belong in certain positions. And they all have the same fundamental weakness. They underestimate the very people who are destined to replace them. The question isn't whether they'll be proven wrong. The question is whether you'll be the one to prove them wrong. So subscribe to Black Revenge Diaries because we're just getting started, and every story we tell is going to prove that the future belongs to people who can deliver results rather than people who can claim credit for other people's results. The future belongs to people like us, and it's time to claim it.